Hello everybody and welcome to the Libertarian Party's online debate on Is Liberty Always the Right Thing? Dan Liddicott is up first.
Well, welcome everyone. As Chris said, I'm Dan Liddicott. I'm the party chairman and regional coordinator for Mercia, or the Midlands. Is liberty always the right thing? I'm going to give the obvious libertarian answer, which is yes, which means I don't have to say any more. So I'm done. No, I'm just kidding. No, let me explain that a bit more. Because there are, of course, provisos, aren't there? When we say liberty, we don't mean you can do anything you like at any time you like. And so some people will say, well, is that really liberty? But I'm going to say liberty is always the right thing, because if you don't have liberty, then you have tyranny. That's the choice. To see what happens when you get tyranny, look at the history of the 20th century. It's loaded with it. So that is the choice. It's liberty or tyranny. And what we experience is some hybrid of both at all times. So liberty does have limits, and people will say, well, is it really liberty? I'm going to argue that it is, because you have to understand what libertarians mean by liberty. And it isn't do what you like, when you like, to anyone you like. It is liberty for myself and for everyone else. And so when you understand liberty to mean liberty for myself and everyone else, you understand that that builds into it or implies its own limitations. You know, people who are willing to override other people's liberty in the pursuit of their own can't call themselves libertarians. They can't even call themselves anarchists in the political definition of that word. What we can call them is tyrants, all right, or wannabe tyrants, and you know, there's plenty of those. So when libertarians use the term liberty, they mean equal liberty for themselves and everyone else. And it's acknowledging the liberty of other people that necessarily places the limits on our own. You know, limits such as we don't get to hurt other people, we don't threaten or attack them or physically harm them. You know, we're never guilty of the first strike. We don't take other people's property. We don't steal or vandalize. We behave with tolerance and respect towards others. We respect others' non-consent. Now, you could say, well, most people accept that, Dan. So doesn't that make everyone a libertarian? And the answer is no. You know, they'll say, well, where's the controversy? Because I would never do those things to my neighbour. And as libertarians will say, well, yes, you would. We'll talk about that just briefly towards the end of my introduction. So at the core principle level, there's no controversy between us and probably most of our neighbours on the principles of liberty and on libertarianism. So, you know, the question, aren't we all libertarian then? And the answer is, well, no, because where everyone else diverges from libertarians isn't necessarily on individual behaviour. We all agree on, you know, the limits and the uses of liberty there, pretty much. It's group behaviour or state government behaviour, where we all go in different ways. You know, most of our neighbours wouldn't dream of taking our property and threatening us with violence if we don't hand our property over. But the government or our neighbours acting in concert through government do it all the time. Some of us are quite passive in that. They might not even vote. But many are also pretty vocal about it, campaigning for higher taxes for other people, of course, higher earners than themselves, you know, campaigning for that, all under the banner of getting government to do what they're not allowed to do and probably wouldn't do, which is take the property of their neighbours under threat of violence to fund their favourite projects. We call it taxes and deductions, but it is in effect a breach of those liberties, which most of our neighbours wouldn't dream of breaching by themselves. We can pick another. We could take the idea that none of us would dream of intervening in the personal, private choices of our neighbours. We wouldn't tell them, well, not even tell them, it goes beyond that, isn't it? We wouldn't force them to behave in certain ways in their private lives, as long as they're hurting no one else. But people have campaigned and successfully got a sugar tax, which essentially fines people for eating or drinking things with lots of sugar in. None of their business ordinarily, but somehow through government we find a way for this group behaviour, which excuses it all magically. And the problem with that is this breach of liberty. It isn't okay even as group behaviour. You know, Dr. Mary Ruwart in her book Healing Our World said, if we assault, cheat or steal from our neighbours, we create animosity and strife in our neighbourhood. Yet somehow we believe the same actions will create harmony and abundance when undertaken for the common good in our community. So I think we understand that we've got this double standard here where people believe in liberty on one level, but they constantly breach it on another. Perhaps in finishing, I'll quote C.S. Lewis. Of all tyrannies, C.S. Lewis said, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better, he says, to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's will and cured of states which we may not regard as disease is to be put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or of those who never will, to be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. And so I think liberty is always the right thing, because the consequence of not having it is tyranny. And as we see with history and even in recent actions to do with the response to COVID and all kinds of things, the collective overriding, the collective infringement on liberty will always lead to greater problems, and as Dr. Mary Ruitt put it, greater strife in our neighbourhoods. So that's my opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Benny, up for yours.
Is liberty always the right thing? Liberty can mean many things to many people. To start with, we need to define what it is we're talking about. Liberty means the state of being within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behaviour, or political views. What would be the opposite of liberty? You are not free, and authority will decide what you can and can't do, and what you should think. Would it be right to impose the views of others and restrict them to do only what others have allowed? What if this authority is highly educated and has the collective knowledge of the day's prominent thinkers? Can we guarantee this authority not to become corrupt and self-serving? It could be argued that in some circumstances restrictions should be imposed, for example on our children and other vulnerable people. This group can't be expected to look after themselves. We wouldn't want them to roam free and walk into the road. We wouldn't allow them to have access to certain medicines that will hurt them. However, other people do have the liberty to decide what is best and how to look after those in need. What about everyone else? Is liberty the right thing? Are there circumstances in which people would do harm to others if they were free to do what they want? Is this a risk worth taking? People may agree liberty is the right thing if they could only trust everyone. After all, there are a great many people who are afraid and upset that people are roaming around spreading the deadly SARS-CoV-2 virus. However, what about the innocent people locked up in their homes? Many condemned to live out their final days alone in isolation. What if there is no way to guarantee that everyone can be trusted to do the right thing? Should we instead trust it to enforce restrictive rules upon us all? How can we know that what we are doing is just, right and accurate? The obvious answer is we can't, much like we can't trust everyone either. If we don't have liberty, we have no free speech to correct and ask questions. As Orwell once said, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. There are countless examples of a small few abusing their power to control others throughout history. These abuses of power have inflicted great pain, death and suffering on millions of people. To remove liberty from people prohibits the ability for others to speak out, debate, bring forth new ideas and be free into control of their own future. People's liberty minimises the risk of authoritarian rule, restrictions on our life, and gives us the best chance at happiness. So, to conclude, liberty is always right. We can't guarantee that individuals won't cause harm to others, but we make that choice to ensure we are never slaves to others. Personal liberty brings autonomy to our lives, free thinking ideas, happiness, and a brighter future for humanity.
Okay. Martin.
Hello. When I was posed the topic, I approached it slightly differently. I thought, wow, that's a huge subject. So let's narrow it down a little bit. And I tried to transpose the question to an area that I'm very familiar with, and that's the Great British Pub. I spent 25 years in the trade before going into politics, so it's a topic very close to my heart. It's an industry having a very hard time right now. The lockdown on the licensed trade has been pretty complete, apart from a few takeaway meals and so-called takeaway pints from pubs facing the beach. So what I'd like to do now is look how various government rules have affected the trade, and then have a think how the trade would be if we took those rules away. Since 1991, in the Monopolies and Mergers Committee report that limited the number of pubs a brewery could own, all legislation seems to have been aimed at stopping people going into pubs. Is that a drastic statement? Let's have a look at it, shall we? Number one, by taking away brewery ownership, the pubcos came into being, the likes of Punch and Enterprise that I'm sure you've all heard of. Financed in the main by Japanese banks, swathes of pubs had to be sold for brewers to get under a limit of 2,000 houses. With an extra tier in the profit chain, it was inevitable prices would be forced up. As luck would have it, it came at the same time as a lot of steel and coal workers were made redundant. That had two effects. Firstly, less trade because people weren't working, and secondly, there were a lot of people with a little lump sum. So as tenant after tenant went bust, there were plenty of replacements willing to lose their redundancy money along the way. Imagine a pub on the high street competes against shops either side. Unlike the shops, the pub's products are heavily taxed. Between 2008 and 2014, tax on a pint increased by 40%. And beer, 31.7% of a pint was made up by tax. Only fuel is worse, and it's not a level playing field. 3. The smoking ban. It's a contentious issue, but with 70s pubs there may have been a choice. Because of the pub codes, many pubs have been knocked into one, losing their 2 or 3 rooms just to reduce staffing levels. Now, with only 1 room, pubs had to concede the smoking ban, despite reports of Mr. Blair being reluctant till the last minute. Drinking companies broke up as they could no longer sit together, and trade dropped a little more. In the first year following the ban, over 1,400 pubs closed their doors for the last time. Outdoor heaters had been the answer for some pubs. British Gas estimated that 40,000 extra outdoor heaters were bought in the year following the smoking ban. However, despite them being only responsible for 0.002% of the UK's carbon emissions, Green Lobby have them firmly in their sights. 4. Business rates. All too often, pubs fail to gain access to small business rate relief due to the size of their car park. Once again, pub is worse off than the shop next to it. And to trump it all, shop users often use the pub car park. And 5, opening hours. Though relaxed, which I approve of, there can still be council objections to late nights. This forces a, hopefully, large number of people onto the street at one time. It's not good for the neighbours, and it's not good for the people who wanted one more. In short, a recipe for trouble. Now, of course, we're past that big glut of redundant people with money to invest. Pubs have closed just because they haven't got a landlord. I spoke to an area manager at Admiral Taverns not so long back, and he admitted he's running on a 70% occupancy, with the rest covered by emergency reliefs. One might conclude that government has made a real mess of the licensed trade. So, how would a libertarian approach have helped if we had less rules and regulations and less taxes? Removing the alcohol duty would let a pub compete with its retail competitors. Having a place open and generating money for the taxman has got to be better than closure. 4 years ago, pub closures stood at 50 a week. Even now, it's just short of 28 a week. Smoking. Choice is the key element. I am not a smoker, but I don't decry people's right to do so. In this country, what 2 rooms pubs that are left, why can't choice be applied? Let demand be the key factor. Government is to provide that level playing field with a retail outlet. with the hours, just let premises open when they want to. If they're busy at a certain time, give them the flexibility to stay open a little longer. The landlord's happy, he's taking money. The customers are happy, they're getting another one and they're enjoying themselves. And even the neighbours are happy because the customers are not all piling out in one go and making a lot of noise. Generally find that happy drunks are far less trouble. So I put to you the 5 cases, 5 lots of legislation that have completely messed up the trade, and legislation that, if removed, save it. So yes, on that balance, I believe that libertarianism is right.
Great stuff. So we'll hand over to James Goad.
Evening all. Thank you, Chris. I jotted down a kind of a random collection of thoughts. I mean, there's no kind of single theme here, so but I think what I'm going to say probably overlaps with some of the content brought out already. I think in the first instance, I was thinking of an historical perspective, really. I was thinking of how this country developed, particularly in the kind of post-medieval period, say, let's say from the 17th century onwards up to the present day, and what the economic and political climate was like during that period, when we emerged from the Middle Ages with a sort of effectively a very limited government, which then sort of continued on and was kind of enmeshed with the commercialisation and industrialisation of the country from about the 17th century. So one can see that up until really the 20th century, we operated in very much a regulatory light environment. There were really no sort of regulations early on and really no government intervention in the economy to speak of. Although one could say that the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1847 removed all the tariffs of the vast majority of goods into this country, we became a truly free trading nation. So, of course, government had an influence in the country's industrialisation. But nevertheless, I think for the vast majority of the last few centuries, it's only really in the last sort of 60 or 70 years or so that government has had such an increasing amount of influence on economic policy. Before that, I think the increase in living standards and the growth of this country has resulted in the growth of the empire as well. That was down effectively to a situation where government really didn't have that much influence on day-to-day economic activity. And I think in that sense, it's really closely aligned with that is that political independence was born out of this country's economic growth during the same period. We had the yeomanry, the squirearchy, etc., became an independent economic force in this country and really became the sort of bedrock of the middle class. And it's the nascent middle class really that became a politically influential force. That was something that has sort of shaped this country in its present state. To summarise, in economic terms, certainly liberty is always the right thing. I think we've seen in recent decades the increasingly sort of negative effect of over-regulation and over-taxation of the economy, which has put the country into a great amount of debt, has slowed down economic growth, has had generally a negative impact, I think, on the standard of living and a social migration, isn't it? The betterment of the individual. By giving up our liberty, we also place ourselves at the mercy of politicians. We are placing ourselves at the mercy of a government who are responsible for lying to us, who are responsible for any number of crimes against citizenry. For those of you who look at the coronavirus situation, government policy has effectively resulted in the wholesale death of many old people in old folks' homes. That's fine to say. So let's get on to Q&A.